The theme of the ESRC festival this year is Our Digital Lives, and I was trying to think of a good topic that we can engage with this year, and the subject of democracy came to mind because I was thinking that 50% of people on the planet will vote or have voted in 2024. It's a huge percentage of the population globally. I was thinking, okay, that's fine. And then got in touch with the festival and they gave me a list of dates. And I picked this one completely at random thinking, well, it's not like any major democratic events will take place this week. And then Wednesday happens and suddenly this talk becomes a lot more pertinent, I think. So the subject we're talking about today is elections in the past, present and future, specifically looking at them from an economic history perspective. Now, some of you may be familiar with economic history, some of you may not. We'll go through that. And the way the panel is going to work is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to our three panelists, three economic historians, who will present individual case studies that talk about elections past, a little bit less past, and then a bit more present. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce our panel. My name is Andrew Dorman. I'm the Research and Policy Officer for the Centre for Economics, Policy and History, and I'm joined by Alan Fernihough and Chris Colvin of Queen's University Belfast and Vitalia Yaremko of Trinity College Dublin. Can we give them a round of applause? Yeah. Fantastic. This isn't supposed to be super formal. So we're talking about why votes matter. And a little by way of history and economic history, you might have heard this expression before, history repeats itself. Does anyone know the second half of this expression? The second time is tragedy. I like that. I prefer my version. No one was listening the first time. This is what historians build their discipline on. This is what we strive to do. We like to say that everything's going to happen exactly the same way and that we can look at the past and then predict the future. Economic historians have a slightly different approach. They follow Mark Twain's hypothesis, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And those of you who are scholars of English or have read a poem before know that poems have rhyming patterns. And you can look for patterns, and that's what you're trying to identify. So economic historians look for these patterns in typically big data. So look at large numbers of, say, voters and look at patterns from election 1, election 2, and compare and contrast. It's kind of a lot of statistical modeling, but it's using the past to talk about the present. That's sort of the discipline in itself. If we talk about the history of democracy, it has humble beginnings, we like to say. No one really knows where democracy began. On the one hand, you've got the Greeks who like to say the Athenians were doing it. Well, Athens likes to say that. Other Greek cities make claim that it was them who invented democracy. And apparently Athenian democracy was smashed when the Macedonians invaded under Alexander the Great's father, Philip II. India also lays claim to the birth of democracy until they were invaded by Alexander the Great. So the great enemy of democracy really are the Macedonians, it seems, if history is telling us anything. But as societies and things developed, and we look at kind of the more modern period, these are some 17th century and 18th century examples, democracy became intrinsically linked with economic performance. The Dutch in the 17th century enjoyed this golden age, and for significant portions of that, they had no figurehead and political leader. They were a functioning democracy. And you can see them here sitting under all of the flags of the Spanish armies that they defeated, which is kind of a bit cool, if you ask me. It's an impressive photo. On the right-hand side, you see the French Estates General. And this is one of the more infamous historical mass comings together to vote on something. There was 1,200 members, allegedly representing the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. So what happened? The first two outvoted the third every single time, and this led to that, essentially. So there are unintended consequences when democracy goes wrong. And obviously the French Revolution isn't the only one. The Dutch weren't immune to it either. This is them eating their first minister. Harsh, be safe to say. Johan de Witt was cannibalized. Although setting aside these earlier examples, you have more recent ones as well. The Spanish Civil War erupted directly after an election. Reichstag fire was done in and around an election. Algeria had a vicious civil war directly in the run-up and after of an election, and of course, more recently as well. So there are plenty of case studies that we can look at of the impact of democracy that perhaps don't necessarily focus on the voting itself. And that's why it's important to look at these historical case studies, I believe. When an election is called can be quite difficult. I don't know if you've seen in the Republic, we've decided we're going to have an election in 3 weeks' time, which seems like a very rapid turnaround. Apparently the reason for that is because the Late Late Toy Show is the following week, and that would disrupt everything, which says a lot about voting in the Republic. But however, I think it's an important point to make, is that these things are quite deliberate, and I think our panelists are going to talk about how elections operated and the way in which governments sort of engage with them from this economic history perspective. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Alan Fernihough. Now, my performance background is stand-up comedy. There's nothing more awkward than coming up on stage to silence. So can we please give him and the other panelists a round of applause when they're sitting up and coming down? It'll be a lot less awkward. So can we do that, please? Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was a great introduction, and now everyone's expectations of you are risen and what you're going to say. My name's Alan Fernihough. Some of you will know me, some of you will hate me from teaching econometrics. But I'm going to talk about a paper I did. I spent around roughly 5 years doing it with my former colleague Alan Dorman and someone I knew from my PhD days in Dublin called Enda Hargaden. Both of them are at UCD now. They're the real brains behind the operation. I'm kind of the brawn. But the paper itself was about trying to understand this very important election in Irish history, the 1918 election. And it captures my research, what I'm interested in economic history, and why I like doing economic history as a topic. So as I teach people know I teach econometrics, I'm interested in applied topics, but I'm interested in using those econometric methods, statistics, and bringing it to answer questions of historical significance. And the question we asked here was, how did the extension of the franchise in the 1918 election affect the outcome? Now, our priors were quite strong for a very good reason, I think, because you can see a little bit of the correlation in how events went. 1918, there's a big general election in the United Kingdom. It's after the First World War. The franchise is extended from 700,000 people to 1.8 million on the island of Ireland. So the amount of people who can vote nearly triples. So it's a sea change in the type of people who are voting. Women can vote for the first time. Non-property owning men can vote for the first time. So who are over the age of 21, women over the age of 30. So it's all these new people voting. And in tandem with this, we have a landslide victory for a party that's running on an extremely radical platform, a complete paradigm shift when it comes to Irish politics. The idea that Ireland should separate fully from the United Kingdom, not the home rule paradigm which had dominated in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the idea that Ireland would become a devolved state within the United Kingdom, like a little bit like Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales are today. That changed, and people voted for this radical party, Sinn Féin, on a very radical manifesto. By any means necessary, separate Ireland from the UK. And it's very easy to connect these two events in your head. And people have written, just today I was looking and seeing what people have been writing lately on blogs and so about the 1918 election. The Irish ambassador to the United, this is being recorded, so Fernihough calls out Irish ambassador. He wrote a blog piece on this election, and he was saying one of the primary causes was this a new electorate emerging. The loser of the election, the Irish Parliamentary Party, who had proposed home rule, their vote is said to have held up. The same people who had voted for them before were still voting for them. It's only they were outflanked by these new voters going in, voting for the first time. They have this radical agenda. So people still believe, so obviously the impact of our research isn't fully filtering down, but people believe this. And what we decided to do was, let's put this to the test, right? We can make this a testable hypothesis. We have data on the vote share for Sinn Féin. We have data on constituent level, the share of new voters, be them new women or new men. And if we expect new voters to change the result, we would also expect constituencies with a higher number of new voters to be more pro-Sinn Féin. And what we find is that this is actually not the case. So, this, again, what I like about doing empirical economics is that you have to be intellectually agile, right? When your data don't fit what your priors say, you have to change what you're writing and what your research is about. It's only fair. So support from if any, and so Sinn Féin win this landslide. We have this new electorate, but we'll go to the next slide. So if anything, the new female electorate are less likely to vote for Sinn Féin. And we can think of a couple of reasons why. Well, firstly, there's a greater age restriction on women. They have to be over 30. They also have to be either ratepayers or married to a ratepayer. So they're people who are more economically prosperous. So we think they're less likely to vote for a radical change that would be very disruptive. And being over 30, you're more conservative, you're less likely to want massive change. If we look at the scatter plot, it's quite clear. We can see a very strong negative correlation between. So it's not a case that there's an even sex ratio throughout the island and there's very little variation. There's actually tremendous variation in the share of female electorates. So there's quite some very wealthy districts in Dublin where there's a lot of new female voters, and then there's some where there's very few. And we can see clear negative correlation. So if anything, it goes the other way. For new male voters, that correlation is essentially nil. So there's very little. So what we find is, in effect, that it's not a change in the electorate driving the result, but a change of people's mind. So people change their mind rather than the electorate changed. Well, what could have contributed to people changing their mind? And in part, we say events leading up to this election, be it the 1916 Rising, which Sinn Féin were very astute in attaching themselves to the aftermath of that, and the 1918 conscription crisis, which again, Sinn Féin is seen as, attaching itself to the protest over that as well. They filter into the election more so than the new voters. So rather than having a block of new voters voting for this radical change, it's basically everyone voting for it, right? So they had a consensus across the different voting cohorts. We have some evidence to suggest that areas that suffered more during the famine were more likely to show their support to Sinn Féin. We also have evidence that land values are related to Sinn Féin votes, in the sense that places which have poorer land values, so poorer quality land, and therefore you'd imagine greater levels of poverty, they're also more likely to vote for Sinn Féin. And that makes sense, in the sense it's a radical change, and these people maybe have less to lose. Okay, so I've done my 7.5. The last thing I want to say is that the implication, if you want to attach it to any story you might have today, you'd say, well, you can have big shifts in public sentiment that dictate results in democracy. So there's people who look at modern elections and say, oh, this seat is a lock for this candidate because the demography there and the history, and they're always. No, people can change their minds, and this is an evidence that they did in a historic episode. Okay, thank you. And allow me to introduce Chris Colvin.
Thanks very much, Alan. So we've done Ireland. Now we're going to the Netherlands, a country that, like Ireland, has a socio-religious dichotomy. It's a country with a Protestant Catholic split, but unlike Ireland, found a different way of addressing it, slightly less violent way. We have here, this is from the 1920 census. We see, where do the Protestants and Catholics, where do they live? Well, we see areas that are homogeneously Catholic, with the papal purple colour here, and areas that are more Protestant. Orange, the colour of the Dutch royal family, colour associated with Protestantism, certainly here in Belfast. We can see a large area of the country, what's called Holland, the province of Holland, the provinces of Holland. It's very religiously heterogeneous. You have Protestants and Catholics living side by side. About half the population live in this area. So it's very mixed. And very interestingly, this is from my research published in the Journal of Economic History. We see banks springing up, serving their own religious communities. These are small-scale savings banks. A village will have Protestants and Catholics living there. So on the high street, you see a Protestant bank next to a Catholic bank with their own customer base. Right? And this is not just in banking, this is across all of society. Your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker. If your village is a religiously mixed village, you'll have separate and separated institutions, organizations, businesses, communities, sports club, the whole lot. And this goes all the way up to the political level. So this phenomenon known as confessionalism affects politics. It affects culture, affects society, affects the way people live. And it's strongest in Dutch history in the interwar period, where the religious parties on both sides basically club together and rule in a coalition government, and do so to exclude all the others, to exclude the fascists, to exclude the Marxists, to exclude the liberal and Labour wings as well. So it's a sort of a coalition of religious parties that club together to form this coalition. Here we see elections in the Netherlands in three different critical junctures, I would say, where we see massive change in Dutch politics. 37, so just before World War II. 1994, when we see a final smashing of this confessional politics status quo. And then this is the most recent one from last year, where we see a move to the extreme right in Dutch politics. Now, what's very interesting is the Netherlands is a proportional representation system. It's perfectly proportional. So you take up the number of votes and you see how many there are, and then you divide accordingly. There are no constituencies. This is just the biggest party in each of the municipalities. So although it's shaded a particular colour, there's a lot of parties that underline that. So this is only the biggest party in each area. So we can see in 37, the biggest party in the south, of course, is the Roman Catholic State Party. That becomes the biggest party in Parliament, although they don't supply the Prime Minister, because to work with the Protestant parties, the Protestant Party sort of says, oh, well, we'll get the Prime Minister. But anyway, they club together, they divide power between them. Here we see the Nazis, the NSB. They only have, they don't have a majority anywhere apart from some very small areas. And the Nazi Party, the Dutch Nazi Party, are quite interesting. At this point, they're not anti-Semitic, or there's an anti-Semitic wing in them, but they're more interested in sort of Italian fascism, where they want to divide society in a very different way. Instead of by religion, they want to divide their society and their economy by through corporatist lines. So this means a coalition of labour and of business owners and of it's sort of instead of dividing society that way, you're dividing across interest groups. You know, the poor, the middle, the rich, and working together, right? And this is actually what happens in the Netherlands in the post-war settlement. Following World War II, we moved in the Netherlands to something called a polder model. A polder named after the phenomenon of reclaimed land. See this? This is a whole reclaimed land portion of the Netherlands. They're really big into this. Poldering requires working together. So this polder model is, you see this in work I've been doing with Philip Fleers, my co-author here at Queen's. We look at how businesses are formed and how they die across the 20th century. And in this period, we see a lot of shareholders We see a lot of business owners basically going for voluntary bankruptcy when they're not interested in running their firm anymore, when it's not profitable, they go bust. In this post-war period, we don't see that anymore. We see a much reduced number of bankruptcies, and certainly no voluntary bankruptcies. What happens is the firm, as a business organization, doesn't become about profit maximizing anymore. It's more about stakeholder capitalism, where you have shareholder and worker primacy, where the firm is more about employment maximizing rather than profit maximizing. So we see a lot longer, more longer-lived firms. It's a very different capitalist system, if you like. And here, this is where the Labour Party win for the first time, and they come into to government in combination with the Liberals, excluding the Christian parties, who by this point have merged into a single Christian Democratic Party. So Protestants and Catholics working together in harmony, right, in one single political entity, but they don't have nearly enough seats to join this government. This most recent one is very interesting. This is where Geert Wilders' party, which is in purple, it's a landslide. They're the biggest party everywhere. But they only have about, still less than a third or quarter of the overall seats, because it's this proportional system. They have to work with others. Who do they work with? Well, they're working with a farming party. They're working with this other kind of protest party that has come out of the Christian Democrats. So the Christian Democratic Party has splintered again. The farming MPs that represent the interests of farmers, of rural Netherlands, they're also formerly from the Christian Party. So you see a coalition between former Christian Democrats and these sort of crypto-fascists, if you like, working together, excluding everyone else. So the times have quite changed. So we saw the religious parties excluding everyone else by coalescing together. Now we see everyone else coalescing to keep the religious parties and the Labour Party and all that out. Because the Labour Party is second biggest everywhere. So that's the end of what I want to say, I think. Other than this is the future. We don't know what's going to change next in our economic system. Is it going to look more like this, or more like the 90s? Is it more, how is society going to be organised? What is the coalition between interest groups going to look like? Who is going to club with who to organise this uber capitalist country of the Netherlands, where capitalism was birthed? Right. So thanks very much.
And I guess I'll jump in for Chris because he forgot. I'll introduce Vitalia.
Oh yes, Vitalia. Yes. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chris, anyway. Sorry. So Chris has led us from 20th to 21st century and will be staying there for now, but transitioning to Ukraine. And its experience is interesting because after spending 70 years under control of Soviet Union, where elections did not matter, since 1991, Ukraine started re-establishing its electoral system and learning from its mistakes the hard way. And its experience can provide valuable lessons about the importance of fair elections and about importance of people's response to electoral violations. So now I will discuss a pivotal event in modern Ukraine's history, the Orange Revolution, which started off from 2004 presidential election. So there were two main candidates, pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko and pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister endorsed by the incumbent president. And the dispute reflected a broader societal division about Ukraine's future trajectory, whether to align more closely with the West, in particular European Union, or Russia. So in the first round of the elections, with over 20 candidates, both Yushchenko and Yanukovych earned about 39% each. So it was quite tight. There was suspicion there could be some fraud in the first round, but it didn't matter much because two of them got into the second round. And for the second round, exit polls predicted that Yushchenko would win by 11% margin. According to official results, he lost by about 3%, or 1 million of votes. And there were huge concerns that these results were falsified due to rampant violations in the protocols. Nonetheless, the Central Election Committee, in a few days, announced Yanukovych the winner of election. In response, Yushchenko initiated a series of peaceful protests demanding for annulment of the rigged election results. And these protests were massive, with up to 500,000 of people gathering at Independence Square in Kyiv at their peak. And they lasted for about a month, even after the Supreme Court annulled the second round results and ordered a revote for December 26. And since Yushchenko's campaign color was orange, this protest became known as the Orange Revolution. So during the revote, when crowds were still protesting in the streets and much more scrutiny was to election, there was much less space for manipulation. So this time, Yushchenko won by 8% margin and by over 2 million votes. So in the short run, revolution was a success. Before discussing the long-run consequences, let me zoom into how were round two results falsified. So there were a number of issues, but the two most important ones were turnout and vote manipulation by the election officers who, simply put, were left unsupervised for too long, and they wanted that to happen. And some of this can be noticed even from comparing the aggregate election results for round two and rerun. So this is the results for round two. This is the round according to which Yanukovych won, and that was annulled by the Supreme Court eventually. So the orange and blue bars show the number of votes for Yushchenko and Yanukovych respectively. So orange pro-Western, Yanukovych pro-Russian, blue. And a dotted line shows the turnout for the elections. So what you can see from this graph, not surprisingly, Yanukovych received majority of his votes from Eastern Luhansk and Donetsk regions, so that's predictable. What is surprising is a turnout of over 90%. So in Donetsk region with over 5 million, almost 5 million people, turnout was 96.5%. I counted the turnout in this room. It's not more than 70. How do you make 5 million people come to elections? So it is suspicious. And during the rerun, turnout dropped to 84%. Still very high for this area, but much lower. And this drop in turnout reduced the number of votes for Yanukovych by 600,000, reducing his original advantage of 900,000 votes by 2/3. And this is just elimination falsification in one region, and Ukraine has 24 regions. And there were many other issues. For example, in Kirovohrad region, you can see here that the number of votes for Yushchenko increased, yellow bar, even though the turnout dropped. So fewer people came to vote. So it's quite likely that in the previous round, when Yushchenko received fewer votes, it must have happened due to either invalidating ballots or miscounting votes from Yushchenko to Yanukovych. And so fixing this kind of issues in the rerun made Yushchenko president, and he gained extra million of votes, while Yanukovych lost 2 million of votes. So now let's talk about the long-term consequences of the revolution. So unfortunately, they were not as profound as originally anticipated, particularly because the revolutionary leader, Viktor Yushchenko, during his presidency, failed to fulfill many of his promises, and in 2010, his arch-rival, pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, became legitimately the president of Ukraine. And that caused a series of disastrous events that I will not discuss now for the sake of time. But Orange Revolution did have other really important consequences. For example, it promoted changes in electoral legislation in Ukraine that made violations like this in 2004 much less likely. Additionally, and probably most importantly, it set the precedent for Ukrainians standing up for their democratic values against corrupt authorities. And it made people realize the power of their voices, making it very hard to silence them again. And while the Orange Revolution has not been a final destination with a happy end, it has clearly been an important turning point in Ukraine's history. Thank you.
I'll take that. I presume if we press black, it will unblack. Aha!
Yes.
Smashed it. Okay, fantastic. So we've had three very different but very interesting and still quite interlinked perspectives, because on the one hand we have most recently with Ukraine, a country that only recently did elections start to matter. In the Irish case as well, maybe this is the first election where they thought, oh, maybe there's something tangible to vote for here. And then we have one of the oldest democracies in the world and their experience throughout the 20th century. So three very interesting perspectives. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A now. So I've got these very fluffy microphones. They don't make you louder, but if you don't hold it when you ask a question, the sound guy can't hear you. So I know it's a bit arbitrary, but please don't talk until you're holding a microphone. First of all, do we have any questions for the audience, or shall we start with my questions? Okay, I'll open the floor. And I'm going to sit down for this because I'm lazy. So this is a festival of social science, as we said, and we're all economists. What role do you think your economics either had on your election, or what economic impact was there from the democratic change you've observed? That's a question for all three of you. Start with Alan? Yeah, sure. Yeah. You're closer.
So for 1918 in Ireland, this usually what you'll get with elections is parties will put together manifestos and they'll say, here are all our policies. In 1918 in Ireland, there wasn't that. It was a referendum effectively on the future constitutional status of Ireland in the United Kingdom. So there wasn't like, we're going to have this macroeconomic policy or this, social policy. So there wasn't really any, economic kind of debate happening at the time. The consequences of it are, well, Ireland does get there's partition, there's creation of the Free State with its own trade policy. Then Eamon de Valera, who's the leader of Sinn Féin, he's a big kind of economic nationalist. He gets to pursue that agenda, and it goes about as well. As you might imagine, a tiny country with no natural resources going to autarky might. So that's the blend of things happening in Ireland.
Good and bad.
Yeah.
Chris?
So elections all throughout the 20s and 30s in the Netherlands were basically rigged in the sense that all the religious parties clubbed together to exclude everyone else, which allowed the status quo to continue. I'm not saying they were rigged elections. I mean, they were quite democratic for the time. But basically, you have perpetual government by the Christian Democrats and their predecessors, which means that they always choose for the status quo policy in terms of, for example, monetary policy. So the Netherlands is the last country in the world to have still had a gold standard all the way up until 1937, which had disastrous consequences. The Netherlands has experienced the Great Depression in a very big way with mass unemployment and deflation, and so that we can link directly to these to the way the electoral system brought this coalition. So I think that I think electoral politics and the policies of the government can have profound consequences through, for example, you're choosing the way you organise your currency.
No.
Yeah.
So elections and trajectory of the country could have impact on people, like on macro level, like how economy is doing, and on personal level, your personal income. And so in case of 2004 elections, well, the contest between European Union and Russia obviously affects how the country's economy would evolve over the next years. And economic component was very important in that dimension. So of course the ideology has been involved to some extent, because some people just preferred to associate with Europe ideologically, and there's a long history of tensions with Russia. But economics, like, there were big prospects for Ukraine's collaboration with Europe, and therefore a lot of people, over 50% of Ukraine's population, was supporting European integration rather than closer association with Russia. And that also should have affected individual well-being, like job prospects, various development opportunities. And actually, according to researchers, in the regions that more strongly supported Yushchenko, companies' productivity was growing faster a few years following the elections. So it's not clear whether it's due to additional opportunities that opened up, but then relative to just reshuffling in the country that always has someone winning and someone losing. But it seems like voters could foresee the prospects that would come with a particular type of course for the country.
Brilliant. Yeah. Any questions from the audience? Not yet. You stay right there, guys. I'll think of one. But actually, I do have a question for Alan. So we've seen this week that polls are not necessarily the best predictors of what's going to happen. So if you are, in your research, trying to think about, well, women are, or people with land are more likely to vote for X party or Y party, how do you make those assumptions? Or are they coming from your own modern perspective, or are they built off data that you've got?
Sorry, do you mean like from my perspective, doing the analysis?
Yeah, doing the analysis, yeah.
What are we doing? What do we do?
So what assumptions is how do you create the assumptions that ground your analysis, essentially?
Oh, so the analysis is just the data points are the constituencies, and then the explanatory variables are basically the share of new voters. So you see the place with the highest share of new female voters is Dublin, right. South kind of Rathmines area. And there you say, well, if there's a relationship between Sinn Féin votes and share of new electorates, you would see it then when we do the regression models, which are, I mean, I can go through all the OLS Gauss-Markov assumptions if people would like. But
please don't.
So basically you're just putting into your textbook econometric model. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the poll number, I mean, I think historically, the start of the 20th century in Ireland, they might have had a better sense of who was going to win versus not, because they had very strong ground game. Like, you know, there's lots of canvassing on the ground. You know, there's fights often between Irish Parliamentary Party canvassers and Sinn Féin canvassers, Sinn Féin causing trouble as usual, and they go around and they know who's going to get in. Like, there's lots of uncontested seats as well, and there were before for the Irish Parliament, because they know who's going to get in. They're like, look, you don't have a chance of winning this constituency, don't run a candidate. There's electoral pacts as well. Irish Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin run electoral pacts because they know, look, this is what we're projected to get. So it's not like in the last, 20 years with the emergence of big data and all these fancy computer methods that people have gotten better at predicting who's going to win. In fact, sometimes just, having a good sense of talking to a few people around the area. That's why your man Dominic Cummings, like, that's why he loves those small focus groups. Yeah. And people do, the political parties all use tiny focus groups where they just let people talk. And they feel like they get more from it than surveying people who don't want to give their opinions to pollsters who ring up, Anything
else? Yes. Again, let's wait for the mic. Fire away.
Thank you. So this is open to anyone here. As countries develop, do you think we move away from single issue voting? Or do you think comes up time and time again?
Shall I go for
You go.
I think it's the opposite. So as the Netherlands has developed in more recent decades, it's all about single issue voting. So why is the extreme right winning, doing so well in the Dutch electoral system? Well, it's a perfectly proportional system, right? So that helps. So in a first past the post system like the UK, you can be the party with the most votes and still get 0 seats. It's technically possible. Not possible in the Netherlands. But it allows you to actually then have single issue parties. The Netherlands has a party for the animals, I kid you not. It has a party for the elderly. It has at least 3 variants of fascist parties that I can count. And they multiply. They're very single issue parties. So I think in answer to your question is the actual system helps with single issue parties, but also in the modern world, why were people voting for what they were? It was single issue migration. They were very, which is reminiscent of, I think, a number of other elections around the world too. But that was the biggest driver of that result. Perceptions about migration maybe more than the economic facts. Yeah.
Anyone else like to chime in on that?
Well, I think, yeah, with development, it's probably more likely to be convergent to single issue voting, because countries at earlier stages of development, like Ukraine is a relatively young country, like its electoral system is young. Parties don't have clear political ideology and it's often conflicting. So it would be easier to vote if you could just see this party stands for particular issue and another party stands for something else. It can be very mixed up and it makes things much more complicated, I would say.
Very good. Any further questions from the crowd? Chris, the Netherlands is also a monarchy. Mm-hmm. So they have this very unusual electoral system tied with a monarchical rule. So how does that work?
Well, until quite recently, the royal family, the monarch, the queen, the king and before the queen, had, I would say, more power than the British royal family, because of the proportional system means once you've had an election, how do you start the coalition building process? And it was in the royal family's, the monarch's prerogative to choose potential coalition partners, to exploratory commissions to figure out how to organize. And with that power, they could people have argued they helped engineer the status quo. Right, so that's all been removed now. The royal family, since I think the 90s, is now pretty much just figureheads. But you're right. The monarchy. It's kind of like it's only been a monarchy since 1815, right? The Orangists were a stadtholder. Before in the Dutch Republic, which is kind of like a quasi-elected military leader, but the Dutch Republic was a democracy. Those in charge of the purse strings, were a series of devolved parliaments that clubbed together, right? So it's a modern invention of the British. Actually, they wanted a kind of a buffer state after the Napoleonic Wars, and they're just used to having monarchies here in the UK, so they imposed one on the Dutch. And I think there's still a lot of people in the Netherlands who are against the concept of having a royal family. But I think that problem is less pertinent now because they don't have any power. It
wouldn't be like the British to impose a government on anyone in the 19th century. Sorry, yes, we have a question at the back. Could the mic do some backflips? Fantastic. Thank you.
We've seen the rise of a lot of far-right parties across Europe, and it's kind of raised the question of could that or would that happen in Ireland in the future at any stage? But maybe a bit more broadly than that, are there any particular lessons from the economic history of elections that would point to kind of the future of politics and elections in Ireland?
In Ireland, well, I don't know to answer your first question. And that's probably not because I'm lazy, but the finding of my research, like the electorate can change their mind. Sentiment can go all over the place. You can't predict what people are going to think and vote in 5 years time. I'd say in Ireland, it may be more of a buffer against any kind of extreme party getting access to power because of just the way the state is managed and governed, the PR system. Like, I mean, I think there's an interesting debate to be had is what's better, first past the post or PR. And I think PR does a good job at, if you don't like extreme parties or fringe parties getting in, it's very good at keeping them out of like properly forming a government, because people don't want to you have to bargain if you're in a PR system, right? You're never going to win outright. So that's less likely. I prefer first past the post.
They are more likely to get a seat in Parliament than
yeah, but like getting a seat in Parliament is neither here nor there if you're not over the reins of power. You know, the reins of power are where it matters. Like there's loads of strange people who'll get a seat. Do you know what I mean? And they'll stand up and they'll be in the news, but they're not at where the power making takes process between the executive government and the civil service and the fights they have to have, and that's really what's going on, who controls those levers.
The Netherlands, where of course you do have an extreme right party as the biggest, the only way they made it work was to have a prime minister who is not political. So the only way the extreme right is able to basically be part of this government is to in some way give up their extreme views, because in a coalition government there's a coalition agreement which is very precise on what they can and can't do, and also to not supply the leader, which is typically the biggest party's right. So proportional systems. I'm more in favour of proportional systems. I think you're more in favour of first past the post. Yeah. I think proportional representation is sort of moderating. Moderates extremes. I think, and I think that might.
I agree with that. But the thing I like about first past the post versus PR is that in PR systems you get these turds that you can't flush, like these big parties that they're always there. Like, how are you keep getting elected and like keep manage to hold on to power? Like, so I don't know. There's advantages and disadvantages. I think first past the post is more exciting as well.
What does
right?
Ukraine have?
So proportional system for parliament elections, and majority system for presidential. And yeah, in terms of extreme parties, Ukraine has some, but they don't get pretty much any votes, despite the misinformation you may have heard in news. So just clearing that out, because it's important to be informed and know actual facts rather than whatever someone wants you to know.
Yes, question in the middle there.
Yeah, so it's for all three of you, but did you look at like how inflation can be a factor in the shifting of the electoral map in these cases? Because it's basically like, I mean, this year where we have most incumbent parties are effectively losing elections, and it's become the sort of main culprit. So I wonder if there's lessons to be drawn from history there.
Well, in my case, it was deflation. It was the opposite. So in the 30s was a period of persistent falling prices, which but the emerging fascists didn't really capitalize on that very much. They remained very small, and in World War II even they weren't very, when the Germans invaded and annexed the Netherlands, there weren't very many like fascists to put in charge of this new state. So in the end they didn't bother. They got an Austrian in, right? So I can't remember what the question was. I'm talking about World War II. Inflation. So I think deflation explains some of the issues people were voting about, but not the outcome. In my case, although the more recent case, maybe there's a case to be made. That's quite recent current affairs, and I'm more of a ancient historian. Yeah.
Vita?
Yeah.
So in addition to economic history, I also do macro. So inflation can matter for electoral preferences. And say in the US, it was like the recent elections, the uncertainty about them was very substantial effect on expectations, and expectations affect preferences over which candidate you prefer. But there is whether inflation affects what party is elected, and in particular if there is switch in power. I think it depends on how well population is informed about causes of inflation. So is it about bad policies, or is it about big shocks like pandemics? And second is how much populism is involved from opposing parties that basically say we will cure all the diseases and fix all the problems, and that's how they may come to power. But in Ukraine experienced hyperinflation in mid-late 1990s, and it had the same president for 2 terms who was pro-Russian and yet maintained his power despite all these issues. So not necessarily.
In Ireland's case, it's just unemployment over the 20th century is a big predictor, I think, of the electoral cycle. People care about getting jobs, and inflation is really secondary to that. I mean, the oil crises are kind of like happen at a period of, it's very unstable in Ireland, but people will always point to unemployment as being the thing. But again, it's a thing, it's like inflation, it's not GDP per capita, which is what typically economists see as like the benchmark comparing economic prosperity. But I don't think it rings true with the electorate. They care about inflation and unemployment.
Was there a question here? Or just one there. Back to you front.
Hi, so my question is on the Ukrainian Orange Revolution, and I was wondering, in that 2004 election, obviously the first results had been rigged, or there was mismanagement of the vote counting, which favoured the pro-Russian candidate, and the pro-Western candidate was actually the real winner whenever the vote was redone. So I find it interesting that you say that the pro-Russian candidate was elected after that, and I wanted to ask if there were any issues with legitimacy there, if people were asking questions, or had the legislative reforms in the electoral process been enough to satisfy people that the elections had been fair?
So according to that was I was also thinking about and actually checking, because I couldn't remember it clearly, but yes, the elections were declared to be fair by the international observers, and there must have been much fewer issues because the electoral system was actually reformed. Like, for example, in 2009 they created electronic voter registry, which didn't exist in 2004, and so people who were deceased, who didn't exist, could be participating in in elections. Yeah, so that was fixed. The issues with remote voting, so if you move from one place to another, like because of work, and you were allowed to vote, like in 2004 election, people could vote in multiple places simultaneously. Again, so that was not possible later on. So, and the reason why actually the pro-Russian candidate won, it was to a large extent, so that he won by quite a tight margin, just 3%. And basically that was because his opponent didn't have support from the incumbent president. She was originally on his team, but then there were some disputes, and due to this lack of support, eventually she lost by a tight margin.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, one on the end here.
This one's a little bit detached from like your presentations, but I was just wondering with the shift in the electoral maps from the 90s to 2023, are we seeing like increasing polarization and extremism that can be tracked to like algorithms curating information through like social media and search engines and stuff like that? I don't know if I'm wording the question very well, but
it's because I mean the whole title of this, or the whole festival, is supposed to be Our Digital Lives, and I think that's the idea of people being fed either misinformation or something like that through a digital sphere is quite an important point.
Yeah, it might be. I guess we've taken the title to mean let's look at historical elections digitally and try and use digital methods to understand historical elections.
Yeah.
But propaganda is not a new thing. So newspapers were this mass market thing. Everyone bought them, sometimes multiple times a day, and they're associated with different parties. So parties or interest groups, single issue groups, even creating their own newspapers. So in my work, there was a specific paper just for the pro gold standard lobby, and another one for the anti-gold standard lobby, and they had wide print runs, and they were weekly publications. So just because we've gone to digital, everything's on your phone, doesn't mean we're not reinventing the wheel. There was I think maybe it makes it more efficient. They can target people maybe more. I don't know. I don't know enough about the current affairs. I'm again more of a historian, but I don't think it's brand new. This sort of the stuff we talk about in terms of means of accessing your electorate and feeding them the information you want them to know.
Was there misinformation in the 20s, Al? Or in the 1918?
Well, there was running battles on, canvas trails and people promising this, that and the other, but the major act of censorship was the Sinn Féin manifesto, which was heavily cut down. So they had to submit it to Dublin Castle, and then they had bits in it that, lots of it gets redacted, taken out, but the one entire sentence that gets taken out is that they will establish an Irish state by any means necessary, and that is just completely, they're not allowed to do that. Okay, so and their newspapers and so on were very subject to censorship and control and all of these things, and didn't work very well, did it?
I suppose in Ukraine.
So during 2004 elections, there were issues with media presentation of information about candidates. So according to international experts, before the first rounds, Yanukovych, pro-Russian prime minister, was disproportionately represented in media, and the statements he made were ambiguous in very many cases. And fact check was not as popular back then, so there have been a lot of issues. Now the current law on presidential elections actually has several sections on media coverage of candidates that demands equal treatment of candidates, even equal price per minute of media time, on screen. So there has been progress in this regard. But yeah, of course, misinformation can happen in digital world increasingly, because there is no person who can be responsible for that, except for maybe the person who posts that, and you cannot really verify everything. But my hope is that it does increase the noise, obviously. So it's much more difficult to extract a clear signal. But as long as important misinformation is fact-checked and there is a source where you can just come and check, the rest will just remain a noise. Because people always have opinions, and we value free speech. So as long as we don't allow us, I guess a little bit of sanity check on personal level is crucial to live in this highly digitized world with too much information.
Hey. Anything else? We've got a few more, actually, yeah. We'll start here and then go there and then finish up.
In all of your cases, you see a big swing in what the electorate is voting for based on one or two issues. Do you think it is more people's perception of these issues causes these parties to form, or do you think it's that these issues becoming politicised increases people's perceptions of how much they're affected by these issues?
I think that's an excellent topic for a dissertation. Which way round does the causality lie? It's a very good question.
Is that your way of saying you don't have an answer? But
yeah.
For the Sinn Féin 1918 election, they're not formed on the back of this issue. They were formed for they were more moderate when they were originally formed, but they are very astute in taking advantage of events that are happening during the First World War. That they hitched their onto the right wagon, like, you know, I'm messing that phrase up, but they know what to say they're for and against, and that's part of getting elected, right? It's kind of being really astute and being in tune with what people want, you know. And that's the matter. It's not like Sinn Féin didn't brainwash Irish people. Like, they sensed what people wanted. They said, this is our party and this is what we're going to run for, and they won a landslide victory. Like, so, you know, people are far too keen to say this person won this election, this person won that, and they're like, you know, they'll blame the person or they'll blame the voters or whatever. But like, that's part of your job as a politician, I think anyway, is to say, look, this is what people want, this is the platform I'm going to run from, and I'm going to make hay while sun shines. Yeah.
Well, in case of Ukraine, well, it has too many existing problems, and it has had too many obvious problems to make up new ones and set elections on them. Maybe in the future, hopefully, we'll get to the stage where we'll be preemptively creating parties to work on issues of the future. But for now, no, well, overall, big issues, like important issues, gender equality, minorities, they are on top. Parliament is looking into them and passing relevant legislation. But over the past 20 years, it was mostly the trajectory of the country, or do we allow land sale that was banned for 20 years? These were the pressing issues that have not been resolved yet.
A question over your shoulder and on the end there as well.
Hi guys, thanks for the discussion so far. So you mentioned propaganda's been quite consistent throughout all of the elections, and past and even present, and then unemployment being an important deciding factor, inflation. I'm wondering if there's any consistent deciding factors that you've picked up on during your research, past, present and future, that we can look out for, and whether they've kind of shifted your assumptions in your studies. I'd like to hear that. Thank you.
So I can talk about my knowledge of economic history research on roles of elections and various government policies and propaganda. So the consensus is you can push information onto people, but if it's not true and it's not trustworthy, in the end they will be trusting you much less and will be actually opposing you. So one example is the famine in Ukraine. Ukraine has experienced severe famine in 1932-33, and authorities were blaming just low agriculture, bad weather and poor productivity, while in fact policies were very important. And so there is a research paper that shows that in places with higher famine intensity, driven by the weather, basically a population is resenting the Soviet policies even more, and less likely to vote for pro-Russian parties. And same is true in elections and in attitudes in China following Chinese famine. So the propaganda, I would say, based on my understanding, it can cause compliance in the short run. So you can fool people once, but you can't fool them forever.
I think for the interest of time, we'll have to move on to the question over there. Okay? There was one more in the front then, which we can finish on.
Yeah. Alan, this is one for you. So, with the success of Sinn Féin in the 1918 election leading to the Free State, do you think, with the success Sinn Féin have been experiencing now in Northern Ireland, being the largest party, will history repeat itself?
Different party.
Different party. I guess is the
Very different
thing.
party.
So Sinn Féin kind of breaks up during the Civil War into Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Like I don't see a lot of similarities between modern day Sinn Féin and old Sinn Féin of the early 20th century, and that's not. It's a completely different time, completely different set of questions they're facing. So it's a very difficult, I say, impossible comparison to make.
Okay. Can I say something on the previous question?
Yes, we'll end with
we'll
this.
end
Make
that
it brief.
Yeah, I think the idea you were saying about you can't fool an electorate twice is very interesting in light of our own history here in the UK with the Brexit referendum, right? So it's presented as a solution to an economic and social problem. It turned out not to be, right? It's a misdiagnosis. People vote in a particular way, thinking that will solve their problem. It hasn't. What bearing has that then got on subsequent elections? It seems to be now all parties want to do is forget about it ever happened, right, and not mention it, so. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's an open thing to think about, but it's a good question. Yeah.
I think we can continue that conversation over pints.
Yes.
So, Thank you very much for attending. Can we please join me in thanking our panelists as well? In the traditional way.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. We've been the Centre for Economics, Policy and History, a government of Ireland funded North-South
research project. Thank you for making me keep my job. I appreciate that.
And the other thing is the bar upstairs is now open, so please join us for a drink.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that paying for the drinks?